Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. First, we'll check in on Max's travels to Europe. He's been traipsing around the continent for the last couple weeks, so we'll listen to what he has to say. And then we'll discuss the ongoing crisis in the Middle East and specifically look at how Europe has responded at the one-year mark since the October 7 attacks. Finally, we'll have a great conversation with Tom Nuttall, The Economist's chief Germany correspondent, about all things related to German politics. We hope you enjoy the show. Max, welcome back to the United States. Tell us where you've been.
It's great to be back. I came back and I'm still married, so that's always a good thing.
How long were you gone?
So I was gone for too long.
Oh, that's why.
But it was one of these trips that I kept on getting these invitations and they were too hard to turn down. So
You're so popular.
Well, there's me no sympathy here. By going to Naples, actually, to the European People's Party retreat. And this is the European People's Party, for those who don't know, is essentially the main center-right party of the European Union. This is the largest political bloc within the EU. It is the party that Ursula von der Leyen belongs to. And this was sort of, before we get into kind of a new 5-year commission period, getting everyone together, getting all the new MEPs to sort of get to know each other. And they had a panel on European defense, which they asked me to be on. And just in and of itself, I think is sort of an important sign of what are the priorities for the EU in the next 5 years. Andreas Kubilius, the nominee to be the next and first defense commissioner of the European Union, was also there and spoke quite eloquently and robustly about what needs to happen at the EU level. And, I sort of gave my spiel about this is the time and the EU needs to go forth.
You mean the one where you're like, NATO has a bank, it's called the European Union?
That essentially is that. And there were great ideas thrown out, many of which I totally agree with, hopefully some of which were inspired by some of the things that we've done here at CSIS. I think the key question, and this sort of came through, is how Europe is going to fund a lot of the proposals that are on the table. But the good news is that they're really being discussed. And maybe just a quick aside, it was sort of, in some ways, moving to see a pan-European party. Then suddenly Ode to Joy is being played at lunch and everyone's standing up.
Very American.
Yeah, very American. And I think it actually says something about the future direction of Europe. One other just tidbit is that there's also a lot of new Hungarian MEPs in the EPP that are first time to Brussels, met with some of them. And we're kind of, I think, seeing some of the harsher, stronger line from Brussels vis-a-vis Hungary. We're recording this today on October 9th. There's a European parliamentary session in Strasbourg, and von der Leyen has just taken a hammer to Viktor Orban, as had Manfred Weber. And it's sort of open season because the Viktor Orban party is no longer Fidesz is no longer part of the EPP. And I think it really represents a new day there. One quick additional aside, I'll sort of group everything else. I went to Helsinki, I went to Berlin, I then went to Warsaw, 2 security forums in Helsinki and Warsaw. The main takeaway there is Europe is still very much, consumed with Ukraine, especially in Eastern Europe and Finland and Poland, very focused on Russia, in the sort of sense that Europe almost is at war. And the rhetoric is really high. But what sort of annoyed me is the rhetoric is really high. The critiques of Washington are at boiling point, particularly when it comes to this question of whether the White House should allow Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to strike Russian territory. And I think that's a legitimate debate. We did it on Russian roulette. What I would say is, where's the money? I think European foreign defense ministers have the knife in the teeth and are like, we're at war. But then I don't see the finance ministers anywhere. And I see absolutely no plan for how the EU is going to, and how Europe is going to resource a long war, which we are facing in Ukraine. I don't see any real initiative there. And so I see a lot of blame shifting from European leaders eager to sort of critique Washington and then not really look at themselves in the mirror. It's very easy to sort of be the kind of, in some ways like a sports fan critiquing, the head coach here. But Europe, you have a team that you control, that you have this thing called the euro currency. You have a lot of capacity. And I am sort of, in some ways, deeply frustrated at the lack of ideas I see coming out of Europe of how they're going to actually back and support Ukraine going forward. And I think that's a little disturbing. And I think Washington, once we get after this election, needs to sort of push Europe a little bit more. We didn't want to do it before when we were having our debate about our own security assistance because we wanted to make it clear that the Europeans were doing their part. And they were. But right now, they're not on track to. because where are they going to get the funding for this? So that was one sort of concern I had coming out of Europe. And of course, we'll talk about Berlin. The German politics is somewhat of a disaster. So that's sort of a tour de horizon around my trip to Europe.
You can't say tour and then say horizon like that. You have to say the whole thing. Tour d'horizon or nothing.
Yeah, no, I'll say it.
You just came back from Europe.
I know.
Give it a shot.
Well, I was just speaking English because that's American imperialism as won the day.
Well, speaking of foreign policy topics that either create cohesion or not, let's talk about what's happening in the Middle East. So I think we don't need to recap everything that's happened since October 7, 2023, but we just passed the 1-year mark and things continue to degrade very rapidly in the region. I think that's a euphemism, but I think that's the easiest way to describe this. So we've seen the conflict in the region degrade really quickly and now spilling into Lebanon, but it's also important to note the really high human toll coming from this conflict. We've heard above 40,000 dead in Gaza, and now the death toll rising in Lebanon, but also parts of Israel, which I think is important to mention as well. But all of this is moving really fast and in a very concerning direction. And we've seen from Europe kind of the negative mirror image from the Ukraine crisis, I would say. Ukraine was really a rallying point for member states in the European Union, and conversations around Israel and Gaza have not been that. Even at the top, within the Brussels bubble, we hear Borrell say one thing, which Borrell has been pretty forward-leaning and critical of Israel's retaliation or offensive in Gaza and now in Lebanon, whereas von der Leyen has been quite pro-Israel. She was just in Israel visiting with Metsola for the anniversary, reiterated the fact that Israel has a right to defend itself, but was immediately accused by a lot of European diplomats of not representing the EU agreed position by not mentioning the humanitarian crisis and impact on Palestinians. So what's been your take on this debate?
So there's no doubt that Europe has been in some ways divided and speaking with two different voices at the EU level between member states. And we had a senior European diplomat come through Washington a few months back, made a very good point, I think, when it came to this crisis and how it's playing in European foreign policy, is that this is a domestic policy issue that plays out as a foreign policy issue. And so it's sort of both. And what you see is, countries like Ireland, Spain, also countries that have very large Muslim populations, approaching the issue in some ways differently than other countries like Germany that have this historical legacy. And so we see European actors in some ways acting more through the guise of domestic politics. And we see that here in the United States. And I also think that when there's many really smart, astute commentators about European foreign policy, Natalie Tocci in Italy, for instance, that have been really critical of the EU and its failure to sort of put together a common strong position. Borrell is trying to do that, but it's clear he doesn't have the backing. And even if he did, it's not clear that the Israelis would really listen to him. And so there's this sense, I think, in Europe of total fecklessness and weakness. And I think that's true, but I think this is not the litmus test for EU foreign policy, in part because, at least in my experience working on the region somewhat when I was at the State Department, is that this is a hard power region. The United States is a major actor, is the security guarantor, obviously playing a huge role in defending Israel from missile strikes and also deterring Iran from doing more, given our huge military presence in the region, that we are there with a lot of steel. And, countries like Russia are also there with their hard power. And Europe is not really there. I mean, yes, the UK and others, and there's been a role for Europe to play in protecting the Red Sea. So it's not that Europe is not a relevant actor, but no one is turning to Brussels. Everyone is turning to Washington to sort of play a role in this. And so I just think this is not the right test case for European foreign policy when Europe doesn't have the collective hard power to really play an impactful role.
I think both are true at once. I agree with you. It's not like actors in the Middle East are turning to Brussels, breathlessly waiting for somebody to do something major. That's definitely true. I also think while it's not a make or break issue for EU foreign policy, it's just once again a sign that it's really hard to make foreign policy that aligns all of the member states. There's a baseline agreement on, the occupied territories, on humanitarian crisis unfolding, on issues around Lebanon as well. But beyond the rhetoric, the alignment of the position remains really hard. And even though the EU is not going to make a massive difference, I look at this as there's once again an issue where they just cannot align. Ukraine is so much more existential. I think it forced all of them to really get on the same page quickly, and it probably was an easier argument to make. This one, it's a different baseline, obviously a different baseline than the United States approaching the Israel-Palestine issue, but it's also the domestic incentives, as you mentioned, are quite different as well. Macron just called for an arms embargo, which is huge, I would say. Again, not going to make a huge difference in practice, but kind of a huge position for him to take when you see that France has one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe, also has one of the largest Arab/Muslim populations in Europe. So there's a lot of domestic incentives playing into this. And I just think both are true at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, there is no doubt that the EU not being able to speak with one voice, not acting forcefully as one, if the EU conceivably could do that, I think it would have a degree of impact. However, this is also a big domestic political issue in the United States as well. It's probably one of the most fraught foreign policy issues because of that. And so I think it's not a huge surprise that we see Europe collectively struggle to figure out how it can have an impact when it is both divided because of the domestic political factors, as well as the fact that without the military capacity to really be an actor in this, it's not as if the EU is threatening Iran with potential military retaliation or is actually the major supplier of arms to Israel. And so the leverage and influence when it comes to what we're talking about is war happening. And it's not on kind of economic coercion, or economic coercion is secondary. I think this is sort of the hardest case for EU foreign policy.
You make a really good point on currently we're looking at this in hard power. Where Europe is strong is also on the humanitarian side and providing that aid, helping with reconstruction. And I think that is where we'll see alignment. I think there's no doubt we'll see that. Also, the top jobs we've talked about so much with Kaja Kallas and Antonio Costa at the European Council, both I think will be people who are very forward-leaning on humanitarian support, on international humanitarian and human rights law as well. So there will be less, I think, clashing at the top also because Kaja Kallas will be more neutral than Borrell, I think, on this issue.
Yeah, I think she'll be potentially more neutral. But like if Kaja Kallas adopts the same position as Borrell, I think it would actually have a much stronger stance because then it would represent the EU. But I think what will happen, I sort of see this as Borrell viewing this as his sort of issue he really cares about. He's now, in the final months, and he's going to, run through the tape on this topic. I've worked for a Secretary of State that was very committed to this issue. It's understandable. I think Kallas is going to view this in a more transactional way in the sense of, Russia will be her priority, but she's going to want to keep Europe united on that. And I think we could see her moving, I think, some of Eastern Europe on maybe not this issue, but on trying to really forge more common positions. I think maybe just to close, and I think this will be a good transition to the interview, is that the big foreign policy thing that we've seen from the EU over the last couple of weeks was the decision on EV tariffs vis-a-vis China, where the EU decided to put in place tariffs. It's been very controversial. In part, Germany decided to vote no, and then Germany was overridden. This is where the EU, I think, has a lot of power, both when it comes to addressing China economically. But one area where the EU hasn't used its leverage is really pushing China on its support for the Russian defense industry, something I would have liked to hear more about at some of the European conferences, but the focus is on EV tariffs. And this is where sometimes the economic side of the EU is not really conjoined with a broader geopolitical and foreign policy vision. And that, I think, is something that the EU really needs to work on, particularly when it comes to China.
I think that's a great segue into our conversation with Tom Nuttall. We are thrilled to welcome Tom Nuttall to the Eurofile. Tom is The Economist's chief Germany correspondent and head of the Berlin bureau. He previously served as the outlet's Charlemagne columnist and as a correspondent in California, as well as senior editor on the paper's digital desk. Before joining The Economist, he worked as an editor at the European Council on Foreign Relations, as a senior editor at Prospect magazine. Tom, welcome to the Eurofile.
Thanks very much for having me.
So let's start with the broad picture. You're in Berlin. There's a lot going on over there these days, both in Berlin and Brussels, and we'll talk a lot about that. How would you characterize the current state of the German coalition?
Bad. Let me give you a bit of background. I'm actually in my second stint in Germany. I was here until March 2022. So that was the very early days of the current government, the so-called traffic light coalition, three parties led by the Social Democrats along with the Greens and the Free Democrats. And I restarted this job in the spring, about 5 or 6 months ago. And so after a couple of years away, it was really striking when I sort of turned my attention back to Germany to discover a country that had just slipped into a mood of terrible sort of pessimism and despair about the ability of politicians to get anything done. And in particular, the relationship between the three parties in this coalition, which is just catastrophically bad. As a lot of your listeners probably know, this is more or less the first time that post-war Germany has had a three-party coalition. There are one or two instances in the very early years, but you usually get two-party coalitions here. And because politics in Germany, as in so many European countries, is fragmenting, to make up the numbers, they needed to get three parties together last time around. And it's going very, very badly. There's endless speculation that the government may not serve its full term. We've got a year to go, just under a year, until the next federal election. I think, for what it's worth, that the government probably will survive that full term. It's much harder in Germany than it is in other countries to break up a government. And because all of the parties are so unpopular with voters, none of them have a direct electoral impact to go to the polls early anyway. But the fact that this is a kind of ongoing, endless source of speculation tells you a lot about just how bad the mood is here, I think.
Tom, I want to pick up on that last point in a second, but I guess but first to sort of go back into sort of why Germany is sort of in the kind of current place it is with this coalition. Is it any particular party's fault? Is it Chancellor Scholz not showing enough leadership and direction? Was it the war in Ukraine sort of scrambling what was sort of a very long and detailed sort of coalition agreement that was reached after the last election? Then you had the war in Ukraine. Is it the FDP, sort of the quote unquote liberal party, just becoming the kind of skunk at the party? Is everyone at fault, or is there any particular issue that you would point to as sort of the root cause of the current problems or challenges with this coalition?
It's a sort of a crisis with many fathers, and you put your finger on many of them. When that coalition agreement that you mentioned was negotiated and signed in, I think, December 2021, there was a certain mood of optimism in Germany, and I shared it, that after the very, very, very long sort of imperial Merkel era, 16 years as Chancellor, in which Germany, perhaps more by luck than by design, became the kind of European hegemon and was a big European economic success story, but kind of was coasting, complacent, wasn't doing a lot of things, from public investment to bringing the country into the digital era, rethinking its foreign policy. There was a sense that this fresh coalition, with Merkel gone, with her party gone, with some parties that hadn't been, like the Greens, who hadn't been in government for a very long time, in place, that you might have a kind of constellation that could kind of bring Germany into the 21st century in all of those areas and more. Now, the war obviously was a huge difficulty. I mean, beyond Ukraine, created huge difficulties for lots of countries in Europe and beyond, most obviously in its impact on energy and inflation. It was particularly traumatic for Germany, as your listeners will know very well. Germany was heavily reliant on piped Russian gas to power its heavy industry. Germans are particularly averse to inflation. Incumbents have suffered everywhere because of inflation, but it hits particularly hard in Germany. And more broadly, it kind of undermined a sort of a general foreign policy assumption, I think, that held in large parts of the German elite, not everywhere, but that in essence, that Russia was a country that you could continue to do business with, despite 2014, Crimea, the Donbass, the Minsk agreements, Nord Stream 2, all of these things. And then that was all gone. But it was gone very, very quickly. And you'll remember, literally just days after the Russian invasion, Chancellor Scholz gave this famous so-called Zeitenwende, sort of a turning point speech to the Bundestag, in which he promised all sorts of changes, in particular to defense and energy policy. And the record on that, I think, has been mixed. But in essence, I think that war was one of several things that just derailed this coalition. Another one came last year when a plan by this government to repurpose some money from an unused fund dating back to the COVID era for a climate fund was declared unconstitutional by Germany's very powerful constitutional courts. And this was devastating. It basically kind of blew up the entire basis for the government's budgetary plans. And there's sort of two factors behind that. One is that everything is fiscally a lot tighter now than it was during the Merkel years. You don't have tax revenues pouring in the way that you did before. And relatedly, you have the Schuldenbremse, the debt brake. This is a constitutional limit on the government's ability to borrow. It essentially limits annual budget deficits to 0.35% of GDP, very, very low. And so that meant when this court ruling came, you had no wriggle room at all. And the last thing I'll mention, Max, you already mentioned it, is the role of the Chancellor himself. The general view, and I think it's one broadly that I share, is that Olaf Scholz hasn't figured out a way to place his individual mark on this coalition. Now, what some of the people around him will say is that you can't sort of look at a country like America or France or Britain, where you have kind of strong leaders in the center who are in a position to kind of place an individual mark on their country. Germany is a very different sort of place with its coalitions, with its traditions of consensus, with its federal system, of course, with very powerful states as well as the central government. Nevertheless, I think when we look at the way that Merkel, particularly in her later years, was able to navigate disagreements both within her government but also between the federal level and the state level, and compare Olaf Scholz to her leadership style, then what we see is a very, very weak centre. And I think that it's difficult to see now that people are starting to think about the federal election next year. It's difficult to see how things might get better rather than get worse, because every party, including those in the governing coalition, has every incentive to distinguish itself from every other party as they start thinking about how to maximize their vote there. So it's difficult to see how things are going to get better rather than worse in the next year.
That's a great rundown. And I guess sort of the way I kind of conceive of it, you know, Scholz even sort of ran as sort of Merkel's successor, the hand gesture and all of that. And then Merkelism with the war basically collapsed around him, both on energy policy and military policy, outreach to Russia. And they haven't really been able to kind of figure out a new way forward. But maybe talking about the kind of way forward here, you noted that you expect the coalition to continue through until September. And it's starting to me look like this coalition is in some ways a suicide pact. And when I see the polling that I just saw with the Greens at like 10%, and this coalition, I think, is universally sort of disliked and despised by everybody, including the parties in the coalition. And it makes me sort of really wonder, why, especially if you're the Green Party. I mean, I get it if you're Scholz and you're the chancellor and the FDP, and if there's elections, you may not be in government. But for the Greens that keep on sort of going lower, and the objective here is not to get to 50%. In America, I could see breaking the coalition, that median voter in some, gated community in some suburb may not like that. And I could see the average German voter being, tisk to the Greens for breaking the coalition. On the other hand, it might return them as sort of a change party that is like, we weren't, this coalition sucked and we weren't able to get our agenda done. What is the sort of the future here? If this continues as is, then it kind of looks like devastation at the polls for all three parties, no? Sorry, that was my hot political take after spending, 2 days in Berlin.
It's a good and a reasonable question. I think quickly it makes sense to just go through all three parties because the calculus for each one is different. With the Social Democrats, the problem with these guys is that when you talk to the people around the Chancellor, they will say, or you say to them, look, you guys are tanking in the polls. You're riding for defeat. What are you doing? Should you not, at the very least, get rid of the candidate, perhaps replace him with the defense minister, Boris Pistorius, who's the most popular politician in the country, and so on and so forth. And they will say to you, reasonably, well, you were saying exactly the same thing to us in 2021, when our position was even worse, when we were the junior partner in government. And then look at what happened in that election. We turned it around and we won this extraordinary victory. And sort of it's a frustrating conversation to have because that's not untrue. And in kind of spring 2021, 6 months before the election, we all thought the Social Democrats were going to tank, and they didn't. Obviously, they won. They won a very, very narrow victory over the Christian Democrats. But essentially, the reason that happened is because the Christian Democrats and the CSU, its sister party, chose a terrible, terrible candidate. In other words, the centre-right lost that election. The Social Democrats didn't win it. And to my mind, it's extraordinarily complacent on their part to imagine that we're going to have something similar next year. It is true that we now know, as of a week or two ago, that the centre-right candidate will be somebody called Friedrich Merz, who's also not particularly popular. But of course, Olaf Scholz this time is running as an incumbent. Last time he was running as a vice-chancellor, finance minister, which is something very different. The FDP, as you say, they're now flirting with poll ratings below 5%, which would see them kicked out of the Bundestag. That would be the second time that that's happened in the last decade or so. I think they could very well see themselves booted out. I don't really understand what their strategy is. They are the odd man out in this coalition, of course. They are the source of an immense amount of frustration, particularly with the Greens, but also with the Social Democrats, sort of saying no to everything, sticking rigidly, as their opponents would see it, to the debt brake, not allowing exemptions despite the war and so on. But if there is to be a breaking point with this coalition, which I think won't happen, but is not impossible, I think it will probably involve the FDP either walking out or being kicked out of the government. And then we come to the Greens, your question.
Just quickly on the FDP, sorry. But it also strikes me that they've sort of abandoned some of their liberal principles, particularly on immigration. And so it's sort of hard to, how are they kind of different from being just I'm not sure I'd put them in the Renew Party camp if this were European parliamentary elections, maybe more ECR or, EPP. I'm sort of confused about what's liberal there.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a very different party from the one that older Germans, West Germans will remember from like the 1980s or whatever. It's funny that you put them in the same camp as Renew. I mean, when this government was formed in 2021, Emmanuel Macron was reported in a French newspaper when he heard that the FDP were going to be in government and were going to have the finance ministry. He was like, well, that's it. It's all over for us now. There's no way the FDP are going to agree to anything I want to do. And that wasn't entirely wrong. Yeah, they have become a fairly sort of dogmatic party. There's nothing of a sort of a positive agenda for governing the country that you get. The kind of dogmatic insistence and adhering to the debt brake, despite all of these kind of unusual difficulties that have beset Germany and beset the German economy in recent years, I think is a bit of a turn-off even to some people on the right who can see the crumbling of the public realm and the difficulties in rearming the Bundeswehr and all of these, and also the fact that Germany's fiscal position isn't too bad compared to most of its European peers. And, they just look like the kind of biggest break on getting anything done inside this government. And, were their numbers holding up, then I think you might at the very least be able to make a case that even if it wasn't very good for Germany, it was good for the party. But they're not. They're on sort of half the support that the FDP is always a small minority party, but they were, I think, on more than 10% at the last federal election. And they're now, as I say, they're on course to get kicked out of the Bundestag. So it's kind of hard to know what's going on at a strategic level there for them. And of course, we had these recent elections in Germany's East, which we haven't mentioned yet. The FDP never does well in the East, but they did so badly in these three states that voted. They were basically a rounding error. I think they got beaten by, I can't remember what it was. It's like an animal rights party or a pensioners party, one of these kind of fringe outfits. I'm afraid I can't give you a compelling answer to explain why it is that the FDP has adopted this kind of blocking strategy. And
so then the Greens, what's your take there?
Yeah, I mean, the Greens are... they control two powerful ministries, which is not bad for a party that came third in the last election. This is this kind of jumbo economy, energy and climate ministry under the control of Robert Habeck, who's also the vice chancellor and will lead the Green campaign in the next election, as well as a foreign ministry under Annalena Baerbock, less powerful than it used to be, but it's still the foreign ministry. This is Germany's chief diplomat. And they have really, really struggled in the last 6 months, and they become a kind of pariahs. In a way, I actually find it slightly sort of pathological, some of the hatred that's directed against this party. There have been mistakes. There was one particularly rough one. It was, I wasn't in the country at the time, but there was an attempt to pass a law on domestic heating that was kind of blown up by the tabloids and scared a lot of people into thinking that the Greens were going to come rip out their combi boilers and replace them with heat pumps at great expense. They had to kind of soften the law, and it became a sort of byword, not only in Germany, actually, but also in other parts of Europe, for what goes wrong if you don't think through the consequences of both the kind of the substance, but also the communication of your climate protection measures. And in these elections in the East, they also did very, very badly. And they were the sort of pin-up villains, actually, for both the conservative CDU and also the far-right AfD in these elections. Why are they sticking around? Well, first of all, were they to leave the government, which I don't think that they would do. I don't think this is something that's sort of in the Green DNA. First of all, there's no guarantee that would bring the government down. It's harder to do that in Germany than it is in other countries. were they to do so, they would, and were Germany to go to fresh early elections, then you could pretty much guarantee that they would lose, perhaps 1/3 of their MPs, and the incentives of doing against that are obviously very strong. There's the Greens will also remember 2021 very well, where after surging in the early part of the year, they then fell back a little bit when Baerbock was the Chancellor candidate. So they will know very well that things can change quite quickly when minds are concentrated in the run-up to an election. And they still have lots of things that they want to do. Actually, one of the kind of unsung successes of this coalition is something that the Habeck ministry has done. And this is kind of streamlining bureaucracy and regulation over the rollout of renewables and the expansion of the grid. Sort of sounds boring and technical, and I guess it is, but getting things like that done in Germany can be an absolute nightmare. The distribution of powers between the federal level, the state level, and the municipal level complicates things. There are thickets of regulation on sort of, protecting animals, on how much distance there must be between residences and wind turbines, all of these kind of things. And actually, quietly, the ministry has done a fairly good job. There's still lots to do, but of making that a lot easier than it used to be. So you're starting, for example, to see an acceleration in the rollout of wind energy in Germany. So, when it comes to the substance, there's probably a number of things that the Greens consider that they would still like to get done inside this government. So I think the incentives against them walking out, in some ways are probably stronger than they are for the other parties.
That's an interesting point around wanting to do more still. I think a lot of the conversations around politics these days is so much about what do we do to position ourselves to, win the next time around versus we really wanted to make change, so let's stay in and keep doing that. I want to shift gears a little bit towards the economic conversation and ask in two parts, because I think they're related, around the economy and Germany's role in Brussels. You talked about tighter fiscal space, the economic picture in Germany now, it's quite stagnant. And I think from a lot of what we've seen of Berlin's actions in Brussels and across the continent, a lot of this, some of the decisions that I think observers have found to be throwing a little bit of a wrench in the gears of things that the Commission, for example, is trying to implement, is driven by economic incentives in Germany. So I'm curious how you view, at this moment, the sustainability of the German economic model, given all the forces that are inside and outside putting pressure on it, and at the same time, how that has impacted Germany's actions in Brussels. For so many years, we've talked about the Franco-German engine moving Europe forward. And we're recording this on October 4th when Germany voted no on EU duties on Chinese EVs. That passed anyway, but that was a huge decision for Scholz to also overrule his coalition partners, to say, no, I'm going to say no, because probably the incentives he's getting from German businesses was to vote no. So how do you see those two pieces separately and then working together?
Yeah, this is crucial. It's a huge question, and I'm sort of trying to figure out what the best way to tackle it is. There's two things. One is that there's a growing sense right now that Germany is kind of failing to walk the walk when it comes to kind of building a Europe that's fit for the 21st century. And sorry, that's a bit of a slogan, but there are lots of good ideas around, for example, for how Europe ought to situate itself in a world of growing protectionism, sort of superpower competition between the US and China, particularly when it comes to tech, industrial policy, strategy, all of these sorts of things. We had the recent Mario Draghi report, which was bursting with ideas on boosting things like innovation inside Europe. And there's a sort of a general feeling in Brussels, in Paris, I think other parts of Europe, that Germany is sort of regressing to kind of quite base national instincts on some of these issues. That certainly applies to this vote. You mentioned this morning on whether the EU should impose tariffs on Chinese EV exports. The Germans voted no. The only other countries to vote no were either kind of panda huggers like Hungary or minnows like Malta. And by the way, Germany could have abstained and the result would have been exactly the same because of the way that voting rules in the EU were. That's what the Greens wanted to do. Olaf Scholz very clearly wanted to send a strong signal to the Chinese that Germany remains a strong trading partner for them, and perhaps also to insulate German manufacturers, particularly car manufacturers, from the retaliatory measures that we can expect the Chinese to take now that these tariffs look like they're likely to come into force. A few weeks ago, Germany imposed border controls along its western border with countries like France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, vast amounts of human and goods transport along these borders. This is in the Schengen area, so that there are normally no checks at all. This was done in response both to a horrific murder by a Syrian asylum seeker in a western German town, but also because the far-right AfD was set to do very well in elections in Germany's east. It was an absurd measure, wholly sort of symbolic, upset Germany's neighbors because they weren't consulted. And so add all of these things up, and there is this growing sense that although Germany may like to position itself as the kind of the singular, the great European power without which nothing gets done, that actually, when the chips are down, Germany is not a reliable European partner at all. And you mentioned the Franco-German engine. Franco-German relations have been really, really bad for some years now. It starts with the relationship between Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz. Personally, the men do not get on at all, but it's covered everything from, how to treat nuclear energy, to trading policy, to the possibilities of the EU embarking on another round of big debt raising after the next generation EU COVID recovery fund from a few years ago. It's just broken down. The traditional line has been, well, France and Germany always disagree. And that's why when they can finally overcome their differences and find a compromise, they can bring the rest of the EU along with them. And it's a fantastically effective compromise. And in the past, I think that has often been true. But this time, you're getting the first bit, you're getting the disagreements and the tensions without the second bit. And there doesn't seem to be much of a Franco-German engine at all. And one final related point I would make is that Olaf Scholz inside Europe, just as he struggles to lead his coalition domestically, he has not become a European figure of any stature whatsoever. And here the contrast with Angela Merkel is really, really striking. In the crisis years of the mid-2010s, when, we had dealing with Greece and the euro and the refugee crisis and Brexit and Ukraine Mark I and all of this stuff, you had Angela Merkel at the heart of all of those crises. Nothing happened without Germany. Nothing happened without Merkel approving it or often designing it. Now, a lot of those decisions may have been suboptimal. I think a lot of them were. But regardless, they were done with Germany at their heart. Those days are long, long gone. Olaf Scholz, and I've spoken to diplomats in Brussels and Paris and elsewhere, they find it very dispiriting when he's operating in the European Council. What they will say is that he will sit down, he will state a German position, and because it's a German position, people have to take account of it and to work around it. But he appears to have no interest in the kind of coalition building, the assembling of alliances that is so important to overcome differences, the grand bargains that you always need to make policy inside the EU. That is not something that Scholz has demonstrated any interest in. And Germany, after having punched above its weight during the Merkel years, is now punching well below its weight in Europe.
Yeah, it's surprising that European federalists, if you told them during the Merkel years that they're going to really miss Merkel and over an SPD politician, I think they would have been quite surprised. I want to pin you down maybe just a little bit on why Germany and why Scholz made the decision on these EV tariffs, which just were announced this morning. We're recording this on Friday, October 4th, but that Germany voted no as opposed to abstaining. What is the calculation there? Is this about the SPD? Is this about Scholz signaling to various car companies? Or is this about German domestic politics? Because it really, I think, weakens the hand of the EU. And really, once again, is sort of putting kind of internal German politics above the broader kind of interests of the EU. If the EU is going to have a negotiation or back and forth with China, China now clearly sees that there's real division. What's your kind of analysis of this?
Yeah, I work for The Economist and we like free trade. So we have a sort of instinctive aversion to tariffs. And we actually ran a cover story about 6 months ago saying if the Chinese want to subsidize the hell out of their electric cars and dump them all on Europe and America, then, good luck to them. And that's the best way to get ourselves to the net zero aims that we have in the West. But park that thought, what you said is exactly right, because regardless of where you might stand on the wisdom or otherwise of imposing tariffs on these sorts of manufactured goods, what we have had this morning is the clearest possible advertisement of disunity in the EU when it comes to thinking through these really, really important issues. One of the pillars of German success under the Merkel years was an extraordinary growth in the trading relationship with China. I forget the number, but Merkel made like a staggering number of visits to China. And when she went there, she didn't just go to Beijing. She went to all of these kind of obscure manufacturing hubs where either German investors or German exporters had a lot of interest. Like this was a very, very strong relationship. Towards the end of her time, when it became clear that Xi Jinping was a very different sort of Chinese leader, and in particular, that Chinese manufacturers were starting to climb up the manufacturing chain, and at least in some sectors, were starting to resemble not a customer for German exporters, but a competitor to them. There was a clear feeling here that things were going to start to change, and that's reflected in the coalition agreement. And that feeling, I think, is strongest in the Green Party and strongest in the Green-controlled foreign ministry. So it's been quite surprising to me, actually, to see some of those old instincts kind of returning with Scholz in the Chancellery. And I think in some ways it sort of reflects a kind of combination of fear and pessimism. It's sort of fear that Germany does not have the wherewithal to reinvent its industrial model, to move itself away from this heavy reliance on exports, and in particular for sectors like cars, machine tools, chemicals, where it's quite difficult to see what a plan B would look like if you eliminate China for a lot of these countries. You know, like half of Volkswagen sales, I think, are in China. The car industry, we know, has the ear of German policymakers. It did under Merkel. It continues to do so under Scholz. Now, plenty of analysts point out that the interests of the German car sector are not equivalent to the interests of the German economy, and certainly not of the European economy. You don't always have the sense that the decision makers and the Chancellery have caught up to that way of thinking. And so you're kind of left in a place where a lot of the rest of Europe is trying to figure out how to situate itself in a world that's changing very quickly around it as China becomes, for example, a major manufacturer of EVs, the market share of which is growing quickly in Germany. Most German car manufacturers have been asleep at the wheel, forgive the pun, when it comes to making that shift to electric. I think we are seeing Europe move in a more French, Macronist industrial policy direction where trade and tariffs will be used as an instrument of leverage and negotiation with the Chinese in future, just as the Americans have been doing. That actually that could also serve Germany quite well in the long term. But in the short term, it's best to signal to the Chinese that they are reliable partners, even if most of the rest of Europe isn't.
Maybe let's close with the bilateral relationship, because Max and I sit here in Washington, D.C., and there's, especially in Europe think tank world, there's a pretty deep bench of US-German analysts, but that doesn't mean necessarily the relationship is where it used to be, even though Germany is very focused on its own relationship with the United States. How do you see that relationship over the last few years with President Biden, and in the coming years, if Germany continues to dig in its heels around things that we just discussed, could that affect how Washington wants to work with Berlin, especially when it comes to China?
Again, there's a lot here. I think if we're thinking about the way that the US-German relationship has worked basically since this German government took office under Biden and Scholz, you've got to start with Ukraine. These two governments have been hand in glove on most matters as Ukraine-related matters, often in opposition, or at least in tension, with some of Ukraine's other partners in Europe. So, for example, I think Joe Biden and Olaf Scholz have a kind of shared analysis of exactly how you need to calibrate escalation when it comes to Ukraine. So there's been a lot of caution on the delivery of certain weapon systems, for example, or granting a more recent issue, granting Ukraine permission to use weapons that it's been given to strike inside Russian territory. Another one is the question of NATO membership for Ukraine, which obviously the Ukrainians have been pushing very heavily, including on Zelensky's recent visit to the US. The Germans and the Americans have been the brakes on even issuing some kind of unequivocal invitation to Ukraine to join, including at the NATO summit in Washington a few months ago. I think the personal relationship between the men has actually been important. And there's a very obvious manifestation of this. You'll remember the extraordinary prisoner swap a couple of months ago involving Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist released from Russian captivity. This was very, very difficult for Germany because it involved them having to agree to release a hitman, basically, a guy who was sent by the Russian secret services to murder a Chechen dissident in broad daylight in the middle of Berlin a few years ago. A kind of straight up assassin murderer. they had to release him. And they released him not to obtain the release of any German nationals, but to obtain the release of Evan Gershkovich, but also of several dissidents inside Russian prisons, including Vladimir Murakeza and other people. This was originally negotiated when the Germans hoped to release Alexei Navalny, who they felt a particular affinity for. You remember when he was poisoned, he recuperated in Germany. That deal was supposedly on the verge of being agreed when Navalny was killed. And so it was an extraordinary lift for the Americans to be able to convince the Germans to this arrangement. It would not have happened without that strong bond that the two men themselves had built up, Joe Biden and Olaf Scholz. So all that kind of leads you to wonder, well, what's going to happen after November or January? Because whoever's in the White House is not going to be Joe Biden. Obviously, if it's Trump, then, all bets are off. He seemed in his first term to have a particular animus towards Germany and towards Angela Merkel in particular. A lot of that seemed to be around the big trade deficit that America has with Germany and the fact that lots of Americans are driving German cars. We'll see if that persists. We're told that, unlike last time around, Germany and its European partners have all sorts of plans in the drawer that they will pull out if Trump is elected. They're being very tight-lipped about what those are, but I'd be very interested to see what would happen in Germany on defense funding, for example, if Trump were re-elected. If it's Kamala Harris, tricky, right? Because we would expect, for the most part, we'd expect continuity on Ukraine policy, but you won't expect continuity on personnel. Antony Blinken and Annalena Baerbock supposedly have a strong relationship. Jake Sullivan has a good relationship with Jens Plotner, his counterpart in the Chancellery, and we've been talking about Biden and Scholz. So at the very least, it would take you some time to get those working relationships rebuilt. And on these other areas, Germany, I think, has not yet had to think hard about what happens if its approach to global trade and China starts to aggravate the Americans to the point where it becomes a real kind of a piece of grit in the relationship. It hasn't really happened yet, but this vote on the EVs this morning is, I can imagine that's not going to go down particularly well in Washington. And I think that sort of approach from the German government, regardless of who's in the White House after January, because protectionism and industrial policy vis-a-vis China seems to be a kind of bipartisan issue now in the US. I'm not sure that, Germany being the sort of the sole flyer of the flag for unfettered free trade is going to find particularly receptive ears in Washington, regardless of who's in the White House or who's in Congress.
I think the United States is somewhat disappointed in how strongly, or the lack of strength that Europe has sort of in pushing back on Chinese support for Russia's defense industry, that we sort of view Europe as having leverage, in particular Germany, and don't really think that they've utilized their potential leverage. So I think that, and also war financing for Ukraine, I think will be an ongoing question, particularly if the debt brake remains, and how Germany will figure out how to fund this effort, and not just Germany, but Europe overall. But Tom, we've gone on for a little bit over time, but it has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll hope to have you back on the Eurofile soon.
That's a pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producer Sean Falk and to Otto Svensson and Essie Pekkanen for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.